New Orleans just watched an $85 million hotel pancake to the ground before a single guest ever checked in, and what they found underneath the rubble was even worse than the collapse itself. The 12th of October 2019, a Saturday morning in New Orleans. Sun out, streets already buzzing with that particular energy that only Canal Street has on a weekend. Tourists wandering toward the French Quarter, locals grabbing coffee, the whole city doing its thing. And right there at the corner of Canal and North Rampart, 18 stories of brand new hotels stood almost finished. The Hard Rock brand was on it, the permits were signed. The opening date had already been pushed back once, then twice, but the building was almost there. At 9:12 inches the morning, the top floors just let go. Not a slow lean, not a groan and a crack that gave people time to run. One moment the building was standing, and the next, the upper floors folded in on themselves in a cascading pancake failure so fast that the people on the sidewalk below barely had time to process what they were seeing before concrete and steel were already hitting the street. A passerby caught the whole thing on video. Within hours, it was everywhere, this footage of an 18-story building swallowing its own top floors in seconds, right on one of the most recognizable streets in America. 3 construction workers died. Dozens more were injured. Over 100 people were inside the building when it came down. 2 of the bodies were trapped so deep inside the wreckage that the city had to negotiate crane demolitions, structural assessments, and weeks of dangerous recovery operations just to eventually retrieve them. 1 worker's remains stayed inside for months. And here is the detail that makes this story different from just another tragic construction accident. This hotel was days away from completion. The Hard Rock name was already on the building. Investors had been talking about the opening date, and not one single guest had ever checked in. Not one room key had been handed across a front desk. Not $1 of hospitality revenue had come through that door. $85 million. 18 floors, 3 men dead, 0 guests, and a pile of rubble sitting on Canal Street for over a year. So, how does something like this happen in broad daylight on one of the most watched streets in the country on a project with that kind of money and that kind of brand behind it? Because the answer is not one bad decision. It is a chain of bad decisions made by multiple people at multiple levels, each one trusting that someone else would catch it, and nobody did. Let's go back to where it started. To understand how catastrophic the ending was, you have to understand how good the sales pitch sounded. 1031 Canal Street. If you know New Orleans, you know exactly what that address means. It sits right at the edge of the French Quarter, on the most trafficked tourist corridor in Louisiana. The developer behind the project was Mohan Kailas, whose family company, Kailas Companies, had a vision for something that would anchor that block for decades. A Hard Rock hotel, 18 stories, luxury amenities, rock memorabilia on the walls, the kind of name-brand destination that would draw convention crowds and music tourists and everyone in between. The project was originally supposed to open in spring 2019. Then, that date moved to summer 2020. And still, the city was watching with anticipation, because the promise of a full Hard Rock property on Canal Street was the kind of thing that generates real excitement in a hospitality-driven city. Here is where the first crack appeared, and it happened before a single floor was poured. At some point during the design phase, the development team decided they wanted to build higher. More floors, bigger rooftop amenity space, a grander silhouette on the skyline. The New Orleans City Council reviewed the proposal and rejected it. The approved height limit was 190 feet, and the council was not budging. A reasonable developer takes that answer, scales back the top floor ambitions, and moves forward with a workable design. That is not what happened here. Instead of pulling back the vision, the design team tried to compress their original program into the approved height. More rooms, tighter floor plates, pushing the structural engineering closer to its limits just to preserve the amenities they had already promised. The ambition stayed the same. The box got smaller. And somewhere in that compromise, the math started getting uncomfortable. Construction began. Steel went up. Concrete floors started being poured floor by floor, and the clock started running on a project that was in ways most people on the outside had no idea about, already operating with very little margin for error. This is the part of the story where the building's bones tell you everything. When you construct a concrete high-rise, the floors do not harden overnight. After liquid concrete is poured into metal steel decking, that slab needs time to cure, to chemically bond and reach the structural strength the engineers designed it for. During that curing window, temporary support posts called shoring jacks are placed beneath each floor from below. They hold the weight until the concrete can hold itself. You do not remove those posts until the floor above is ready. Every structural engineer in the country will tell you that. It is not advanced knowledge. It is the foundation, literally, of how these buildings go up safely. Now, here is what was allegedly happening at 1031 Canal Street in the final weeks of construction. 2 days before the collapse, a worker on the upper floors pulled out his phone and started recording. The video, filmed in Spanish, captured something that should have stopped the entire project in its tracks. The concrete slabs above the upper levels were sagging, deflecting downward under load to the point where the shoring jacks beneath them were visibly bent. Not slightly. Bent so severely that the crew trying to remove them could not get them out because the weight bearing down on them was enormous. On that video, you can hear the worker say, "This is seriously bad, Papa." He was not being dramatic. He was describing what he was physically looking at with his own eyes. Workers reportedly went to the contractor that day and said, "Something is wrong, we need to stop." They were told to keep going. That video became evidence in the investigation. A Texas structural engineer who reviewed it said the floor system design was pushing the limits of what the steel decking was rated to carry, with almost no tolerance for any additional variable. Another structural engineer who analyzed the actual collapse footage hired by the building's owner concluded that the failure originated at the 16th floor. He could tell because the 17th and 18th floors came down together rather than separately, meaning the 16th floor gave out first and dragged everything above it down as one connected mass. He described the connection plates to the columns as having sheared clean off. The beams supporting that 16th floor were reportedly carrying 300% of their rated load. Not 30% over, 300%. The structure was not bending rules, it was snapping them. Layered on top of that were the schedule pressures. Lawsuits filed after the collapse alleged that concrete was not being given adequate time to cure between pours because the project was already behind and the contractor needed to keep moving. Workers had also been raising red flags about unqualified personnel on site. In September 2019, just weeks before the building came down, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers was standing on the sidewalk in front of that hotel with signs protesting that the project was using unlicensed electricians. People were literally outside the building warning that something was wrong. Construction continued without interruption. The collapse happened 8 days after the last batch of concrete was poured on the rooftop level. If the engineering failures are stunning, what came next is something else entirely. In New Orleans, as in every major American city before concrete gets poured on the upper floors of a high-rise under construction, city inspectors from the Department of Safety and Permits are required to physically visit the site. They are supposed to walk through, examine the steel decking and rebar, and sign off that everything is correctly placed before the concrete goes in and permanently seals it. That is the system. That is the backstop that exists specifically to catch the kind of problems that workers were filming on their phones. A joint investigation by WWL-TV and the Times-Picayune discovered that 3 city inspectors failed to physically show up for those inspections on the upper floors of the Hard Rock Hotel. They signed off anyway, using photographs that someone else had taken, of a site they personally never walked through. One inspector, Julie Tweeter, signed off on the project on the 18th of July 2019. Location data showed her car parked at her home for 2 hours during the window of time she officially claimed to be standing at 1031 Canal Street. She was not there. She documented herself as present. She was at home. Another inspector named Treadway authorized the concrete pour on the 14th floor on the 26th of July 2019, and according to the investigation, he had never once visited the construction site. He signed the paperwork, he never showed up. The city moved to fire both. One resigned before the termination could go through. And when city officials ordered a broader review of the Department of Safety and Permits, they found significant discrepancies in the records of 11 out of 32 inspectors. More than a third of the department, this was not one rogue employee cutting corners on a single project. This was a pattern, a culture of phantom inspections that had apparently been running long enough that nobody inside the department thought it was unusual. What that means in practical terms: the concrete that sealed the structural failures into those upper floors was poured and approved without anyone qualified to authorize that work ever actually laying eyes on the real steel underneath. The regulatory system that exists to protect workers and the public produced signatures on paper while the actual building went up completely unexamined. The building came down on a Saturday morning. By the following week, Canal Street was closed. Not for a few days, for months. Canal Street is not a side road. It is one of the primary commercial arteries of downtown New Orleans, a stretch of road that restaurants, retailers, hotels, and small businesses depend on for the foot traffic that keeps them alive. Every day that street stayed blocked off was another day those businesses watched their revenue evaporate, while the city tried to figure out what to do with a half-collapsed 18-story building that was too unstable for anyone to safely enter. The city of New Orleans spent more than $11.5 million between the October 12th collapse and the end of December 2019 alone, and that number covers only securing the structure, rerouting streetcar lines, and managing the public safety perimeter. That is taxpayer money. That is $12 million of public funds spent cleaning up the consequences of decisions made by private developers and contractors who are not the ones writing that check. Then came the lawsuits, more than 130 of them. The plaintiffs were workers injured in the collapse, families of the 3 men who were killed, bystanders who happened to be on Canal Street that morning, and business owners who lost a year of revenue while their block was sealed off. The defendant list read like the full project directory: Developer 1031 Canal Development LLC, General Contractor Citadel Builders, Engineering Firm Heaslip Engineering, Architects Harry Baker Smith, Electrical Subcontractor All-Star Electric, and dozens of additional subcontractors who each played some role in the chain of failures. OSHA's investigation concluded with a formal citation against Heaslip Engineering for a willful violation of the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Willful, not accidental, not negligent in the ordinary sense. Willful. That is the agency's way of saying the violation was not a mistake. The law was broken knowingly. People wanted criminal accountability. The Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office opened an investigation, built a case over multiple years, and in October 2023, 4 years after the collapse, presented it to a grand jury to determine whether anyone should face criminal charges for the deaths of 3 workers. The grand jury declined to indict. No criminal charges were filed against anyone. The DA's office stood in front of cameras and called it a disheartening day. The legal threshold for criminal negligence is higher than for civil liability, and the jurors said the evidence did not meet it. The men who designed the floors, supervised the concrete pours, signed off on inspections from their living rooms, and told workers to keep removing bench shoring posts. None of them were criminally charged. The civil cases ground forward. In September 2025, nearly 6 full years after the collapse, the building's owner and its insurers reached a tentative settlement covering claims from more than 400 workers, bystanders, and affected businesses. The amount was sealed. The public will never know the number. And that settlement covers only the owner's liability. The separate suits against the contractors, engineers, and steel suppliers remain active. 6 years, 3 dead. 400 plus claimants. 11 million plus in city costs before the calendar even flipped to 2020. Settlement amount, classified. There is one detail from the aftermath of this story that I think captures better than anything else just how completely this project unraveled, and it is the cranes. When the floors pancaked, the 2 massive construction cranes mounted at the top of the structure were severely damaged. They were left leaning at unstable angles over the remaining wreckage, which was itself barely holding together. Before the city could safely reopen the surrounding streets, those cranes had to come down. Officials scheduled a controlled demolition for late October 2019. The first attempt did not fully succeed. The fire chief held a press conference and told reporters that the cranes were more damaged than we thought, requiring changes in the demolition methodology before they could try again. High winds kept pushing the rescheduled date back, because bringing down a damaged crane incorrectly over an already unstable, collapsed building in the middle of a dense urban neighborhood is not something you get to do twice. For weeks, those cranes hung over Canal Street like a monument to everything that had gone wrong. News cameras trained on them daily, residents watched from apartment windows, businesses waited. And meanwhile, 2 of the 3 victims' bodies remained inside the building, inaccessible to recovery crews because the structure was too dangerous to enter. The full demolition of the remaining building, including recovery of the bodies inside, stretched across years, not weeks, not months. The lot sat there, fenced off and silent, on one of the most prominent corners in New Orleans for an extended period after the collapse. Every day it sat, there was a reminder that the $85 million investment was gone, the brand was gone, the workers were gone, and what was left was a legal and physical mess that nobody had a clean answer for. Here is what you take from New Orleans, from that corner of Canal and North Rampart, from the building that was supposed to be a landmark and became a cautionary case study instead. Every single warning sign was visible before the building came down. The workers' video existed 2 days before the collapse. The bent shoring posts were on film. The workers who filmed it went to the contractor and raised the alarm out loud. The electricians' union was standing on the sidewalk outside the building weeks earlier with signs. The inspectors who were supposed to provide the official backstop were signing documents from their homes. None of it stopped anything. The developer wanted a trophy on Canal Street. The contractor wanted to stay on schedule. The structural engineering was already operating at margins that left no room for any additional variable. The inspectors who were supposed to catch what everyone else missed were not catching anything because they were not showing up. And the brand name on the building, Hard Rock, a globally recognized hospitality company, gave the project a layer of credibility that made it easy for everyone involved to assume someone else was watching the details. Nobody was. 3 men went to work on a Saturday morning and never came home. Their families got a settlement with a confidential number. The engineers got a civil citation. The inspectors lost their jobs. The grand jury said there was not enough certainty to charge anyone with a crime. The developers' insurance companies cut a check with an amount the public is not allowed to know. And that lot, 1031 Canal Street, one of the most coveted addresses in Louisiana, still carries the weight of what happened on it. $85 million, 18 stories, 0 guests, 3 workers, and a city that now knows exactly what it looks like when everyone in the room assumes the warning video is somebody else's problem.